The sun cast long shadows across the arid landscape. As Zachariah Whitfield rode his sorrel stallion along the creek's edge, his weathered face creased with exhaustion after 3 days of chasing cattle thieves through Montana territories, unforgiving wilderness. He might have missed her entirely if not for the flash of emerald fabric against the muddy bank, a woman, motionless, half submerged in the shallow water of Elk Creek, just 5 miles outside of Butte, Montana. It was the spring of 1878, and Zachariah had seen enough death in his 32 years to last several lifetimes. Yet something about this woman, her delicate features, the fine quality of her traveling dress despite its muddy condition, made his chest tighten with unexpected concern. He dismounted quickly, boots squelching in the mud as he approached her still form. Kneeling beside her, he gently turned her onto her back, noting the nasty gash across her temple. Her dark hair, coming loose from its pins, spread around her pale face like a halo. "Miss, can you hear me?" Zachariah touched her wrist, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. Relief washed over him. She was alive, at least. Zachariah removed his bandana, dipping it in the cool creek water before gently dabbing at her forehead, clearing away the blood and mud. "Wake up," he said, his voice gruff from disuse. When she didn't stir, something akin to panic rose in his throat. "Wake up. I need you to stay," he pleaded, the uncharacteristic emotion in his voice surprising even himself. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a brief moment, Zachariah found himself staring into the most striking blue eyes he'd ever seen before they rolled back as she slipped into unconsciousness again. Zachariah looked around. The sun was setting, and being out in the open wasn't safe, not with wolves, nor the thieves he'd been tracking. He made a quick decision. Gently, he lifted her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt despite her soaked clothing. "You're going to be all right, miss," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. "I've got you now." He settled her carefully across his saddle before mounting behind her, one arm holding her secure against his chest as he turned his horse toward his cabin in the foothills. Whoever she was, however she'd ended up half-drowned in Elk Creek, Zachariah Whitfield couldn't shake the feeling that fate had intervened in both their lives today. The mystery woman remained unconscious as Zachariah's cabin came into view, a humble one-room structure nestled against a stand of pines, smoke still curling from the chimney where he'd banked the fire that morning. It was nothing fancy, just a place he'd built with his own hands after leaving Texas 5 years ago, but it was clean and secure. Inside, he laid her gently on his bed, then stoked the fire, casting anxious glances at her still form. The cabin filled with golden light as he heated water and gathered clean cloths. As a former Army scout, he knew basic field medicine, but he worried her injuries might require more skilled attention than he could provide. Carefully, he cleaned the wound on her temple, relieved to find it wasn't as deep as he'd feared. He checked for other injuries, maintaining her modesty but ensuring she hadn't broken bones or sustained other wounds. Finding only bruises and scrapes, he covered her with blankets and set about preparing a broth, hoping the smell might rouse her. An hour passed before he heard a soft moan from the bed. Setting down the cup of broth, Zachariah moved quickly to her side, watching as her eyelids fluttered open. "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper, her blue eyes unfocused. "You're safe, miss," Zachariah said, keeping his voice gentle. "I found you by Elk Creek. You took a nasty fall." Confusion clouded her face as she tried to sit up, then winced, pressing a hand to her temple. "Easy now," he cautioned. "That's quite a knock you took. Who are you?" she asked, wariness entering her eyes as she became more alert. "Zachariah Whitfield," he answered. "Most folks call me Zach. I have a small ranch nearby." She looked around the cabin, taking in her surroundings before her gaze settled back on him. "I'm Nora Thornton. Miss Thornton," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Can you tell me what happened, how you ended up in that creek?" Her brow furrowed, and for a moment panic flickered across her face. I can't remember." Her hands twisted in the blanket. "I remember traveling to Butte, but everything after that is blank." Zachariah offered her the cup of broth. "Don't force it. Memory can be tricky after a head injury. It might come back in time." She accepted the cup with shaking hands. "Thank you for helping me, Mr. Whitfield." "Zach," he corrected gently. "And you're welcome, Miss Thornton. Nora, please." She sipped the broth, color slowly returning to her cheeks. "I've put you out of your bed." He waved away her concern. "I've slept on worse than the floor." A comfortable silence fell between them as she drank. Zachariah found himself studying her, not just her beauty, which was considerable despite her current state, but the way she held herself. There was a quiet dignity to her, even now. "You said I was traveling to Butte," she finally asked, frowning slightly. "That's what you told me," he replied. "You don't remember that either." Nora shook her head, then immediately regretted the motion. "I remember leaving Philadelphia, coming west for." Her voice trailed off, frustration evident. "Why can't I remember? Give it time," Zachariah advised. "Memories like a spooked horse chase it too hard and it just runs faster." That earned him a small smile. "You have a way with words, Mr. Zach." "Not usually," he admitted, feeling an uncharacteristic warmth in his cheeks, "but I've had my share of falls." Nora finished the broth and handed him the empty cup. "Thank you again. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." "Best not to think about that," Zachariah said, taking the cup. "You should rest now. Tomorrow, if you're feeling stronger, we can ride into Butte and see if anyone knows why you were heading there." She nodded, settling back against the pillow. "What if no one knows me?" Zachariah saw the fear in her eyes. A woman alone in the West, with no memory and no connections, was in a precarious position indeed. "Then you'll stay here until your memory returns," he said firmly. "You're safe, Miss Thornton. I give you my word." Nora studied him for a long moment before nodding, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I believe you," she said simply. As Zachariah moved to bank the fire for the night, he wondered what circumstances had brought this educated Eastern woman to Montana territory, and why he felt so certain that her arrival would change everything. Dawn broke with golden fingers stretching across the cabin floor as Zachariah stirred from his makeshift bedroll. He'd slept lightly, aware of Nora's occasional restless movements and soft murmurs throughout the night. Rising quietly, he stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil before stepping outside to tend to his horse and the few cattle he kept near the cabin. When he returned, Nora was awake, sitting up in bed with her hair falling in dark waves around her shoulders. Even disheveled, she possessed a natural grace that made Zachariah suddenly conscious of his own rough appearance. "Good morning," she greeted him, voice stronger than the previous evening. "I hope I didn't disturb your rest." "Not at all," he lied politely. "How are you feeling?" Nora touched the gash at her temple gingerly. "Better, I think. Still rather confused, but the headache has eased." "That's good news." Zachariah poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "Are you hungry? I've got eggs and some salt pork." "That would be wonderful, thank you." Nora hesitated, glancing down at her muddy, torn dress. "I'm afraid I'm quite a mess." Zachariah rubbed the back of his neck, feeling suddenly awkward. "I might have something that could work. Nothing fancy, mind you." He rummaged in a trunk and produced a clean cotton shirt and a pair of trousers that had shrunk in a wash years ago. "These are the smallest things I've got. You can change while I cook breakfast outside." Gratitude softened her features. "You're very kind, Mr. Whitfield." "Zach," he reminded her, a small smile tugging at his lips as he headed outside with the frying pan. When he returned with breakfast, Nora had changed into his clothes. The shirt was comically large, belted at the waist with a piece of rope, and she'd rolled up the trouser legs several times. Her hair was neatly braided over one shoulder, and she'd washed her face in the basin he'd left. Something about seeing her in his clothes stirred an unexpected warmth in Zachariah's chest. "I must look ridiculous," she said with a self-conscious laugh. "Not at all," he replied honestly. "You look, well." He cleared his throat, suddenly finding the eggs fascinating. "Breakfast is ready." They ate in companionable silence, Nora's color improving with each bite. When they finished, she insisted on washing the dishes despite his protests. "I may have lost my memory, Mr. Whitfield, but not my manners," she said firmly. "You've been more than generous." As she worked, Zachariah observed her carefully. "Has anything more come back to you about why you were traveling to Butte?" Nora paused, brow furrowing in concentration. "Fragments. I remember a letter, something about an inheritance, and a name Sullivan." "Sullivan," Zachariah straightened. "There's a James Sullivan who owns the mercantile in Butte." Hope flickered in her eyes. "That sounds familiar. Yes, I think that might be it." "Well then," Zachariah said, reaching for his hat, "we should pay Mr. Sullivan a visit. If you're feeling up to the ride." Nora hesitated, then nodded resolutely. "Yes, I need answers." An hour later, they were on horseback heading toward Butte. Zachariah had found a spare hat to protect Nora from the sun, and she rode behind him on his sorrel, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist. The contact was distracting in ways he hadn't anticipated. Butte was growing rapidly thanks to the copper mines, but it still maintained the raw energy of a frontier town. As they rode down the main street, Zachariah was acutely aware of the curious stares they attracted a known loner returning with a beautiful woman wearing men's clothing. They dismounted in front of Sullivan's Mercantile, a two-story building with a painted wooden sign. Nora swayed slightly as her feet touched the ground, and Zachariah steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "Are you all right?" he asked, concerned. She nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Just a bit dizzy. It'll pass." Inside the store, James Sullivan was helping a customer. He was a portly man in his 50s with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening in recognition. "Miss Thornton," he exclaimed, hurrying around the counter. "We've been worried sick." "When you didn't arrive as scheduled," he broke off, taking in her appearance. "Good heavens, what happened to you?" Nora glanced at Zachariah, relief and confusion mingling on her face. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm afraid I've had an accident." "I don't remember much, including how I know you." Sullivan's bushy eyebrows shot up. "You don't remember? My dear, you came all the way from Philadelphia regarding your uncle's estate." "My uncle." Nora pressed a hand to her forehead. "Yes, Edward Thornton. He passed 6 months ago. He was one of Butte's founding investors in the copper mines. You're his only living relative." The name sparked something in Nora's eyes. "Uncle Edward." "Yes, I remember writing to him years ago when my parents died. He left everything to you, Miss Thornton. The house on the hill, his shares in the mine, everything. I'm his lawyer as well as a shopkeeper." Sullivan glanced curiously at Zachariah. "And you are?" "Zachariah Whitfield," he replied. "I found Miss Thornton unconscious by Elk Creek yesterday." Understanding dawned on Sullivan's face. "The stage was robbed 2 days ago, about 5 miles out of town. The driver reported a female passenger had fled during the holdup. We've had search parties looking, but they focused north of town." Nora paled. "I was running from robbers, it seems likely," Sullivan said gently. "You were carrying documents regarding your inheritance. Perhaps they knew that." Zachariah's jaw tightened. These robbers, were they the Harker gang? Sullivan nodded grimly. Most likely. They've been plaguing the territory for months. The same men Zachariah had been tracking when he found Nora. His hand instinctively moved to the gun at his hip. "Mr. Sullivan," Nora said, steadying herself against a display case, "is there somewhere I might sit? I'm feeling rather overwhelmed." Sullivan immediately ushered them to a back office, settling Nora in a comfortable chair. Of course. You've been through quite an ordeal." As Sullivan poured water from a pitcher, Zachariah watched Nora closely. She was handling the revelations with remarkable composure, but he could see the strain in her eyes. "Your uncle's house is ready for you," Sullivan was saying. "Everything just as he left it, with staff maintained. I can have the housekeeper prepare it immediately." "That would be very kind," Nora said faintly. Sullivan turned to Zachariah. "Mr. Whitfield, the town owes you a debt of gratitude for saving Miss Thornton." Zachariah shifted uncomfortably under the man's appreciative gaze. Anyone would have done the same. "Nevertheless," Sullivan continued, "I insist you join us for dinner tonight. We'll be celebrating Miss Thornton's safe arrival after all." Before Zachariah could formulate a polite refusal, Nora reached out and touched his arm. "Please say yes," she said softly. "I would feel better having a familiar face present." Looking into her blue eyes, Zachariah found he couldn't deny her request. "All right," he conceded, "but I'll need to tend to my stock first." "Excellent," Sullivan beamed. "I'll have my wife send invitations to the town's leading citizens." 8 o'clock at the Thornton house. As Sullivan bustled out to make arrangements, Zachariah leaned closer to Nora. "Are you sure you're up for a dinner party?" She gave him a wan smile. "Not entirely, but I suspect this is Mr. Sullivan's way of introducing me to society." She hesitated. "Will you really come back for it?" There was vulnerability in her question that tugged at something deep in Zachariah's chest. "If you want me there, I'll be there," he promised. Relief softened her features. "Thank you. I feel as though I've been thrown into deep water, and you're the only solid ground I can see." The simple honesty of her words affected Zachariah more than he cared to admit. 5 years of deliberate solitude after the war, after Texas, and somehow this woman had slipped past his defenses in less than a day. "I should go," he said, standing abruptly. "Get you settled in your new home. I'll return this evening." Nora nodded, though something like disappointment flickered in her eyes. "Until tonight, then." As Zachariah rode back to his cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had irrevocably changed, and all because he'd happened to ride along Elk Creek at precisely the right moment. The Thornton house stood on the northern hill overlooking Butte, an imposing 2-story structure built of locally quarried stone with a wraparound porch and large windows. It spoke of wealth and permanence in a town where most buildings were still rough-hewn timber. Zachariah approached on horseback at precisely 8 o'clock, having spent the afternoon in uncharacteristic attention to his appearance. He'd bathed in the creek, trimmed his beard, and donned the one good suit he owned, black wool purchased years ago for funerals he'd rather forget. A stable boy took his horse as Zachariah climbed the porch steps, hat in hand, suddenly feeling like an imposter. Through the windows, he could see well-dressed figures moving about in the warm lamplight butts, elite gathering to inspect the mysterious heiress from the east. Before he could knock, the door swung open, revealing Nora in a midnight blue dress that must have belonged to her uncle's household. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant knot, the bruising at her temple artfully concealed. Only the lingering paleness of her complexion hinted at her recent ordeal. "You came," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I gave my word," Zachariah replied simply. A genuine smile transformed her face. "And I'm learning that Zachariah Whitfield's word is unbreakable." She ushered him inside to a foyer adorned with polished hardwood and expensive carpets. Zachariah had never felt more out of place. "I should warn you," Nora whispered as she took his arm. "I remember almost nothing about these people, though they all claim to have been dear friends of my uncle." Zachariah raised an eyebrow. "And yet you're hosting them." Mr. Sullivan insisted it was the proper thing to do. She squeezed his arm lightly. "Besides, I have you to rescue me if I falter." The warmth in her voice caused a peculiar constriction in his chest. "I'm more accustomed to wrangling cattle than making small talk," he warned. "Then we shall be awkward together," she declared, leading him into the drawing room where a dozen of Butt's most prominent citizens awaited. The next 2 hours were a blur of introductions and conversation. Zachariah observed how Nora handled each interaction with grace, despite her memory gaps. She had a gift for listening that made others eager to speak, revealing more about themselves than they perhaps intended. Sullivan hovered nearby, clearly pleased with himself for orchestrating the gathering. His wife, a thin woman with sharp eyes, seemed less enchanted, watching Nora with barely concealed suspicion. "Such a tragedy about your parents, Miss Thornton," Mrs. Sullivan remarked during dinner. "Your uncle spoke of them often." "Did he?" Nora replied carefully. "I'm afraid my memories of Uncle Edward are quite limited. We corresponded, but I hadn't seen him since childhood." "Indeed," Mrs. Sullivan continued, her voice sickly sweet. "He mentioned you were teaching at a ladies' school in Philadelphia." Something flickered in Nora's eyes, recognition, perhaps. "Yes, literature and composition," she said, then looked surprised at her own words. "I'm remembering more, it seems." "How fortunate," Mrs. Sullivan said, not sounding as though she found it fortunate at all. "And now you find yourself one of Butt's wealthiest residents. Quite a change of circumstances." The implication hung in the air, and Zachariah felt a surge of protectiveness. "Miss Thornton's character speaks for itself," he said, his quiet voice carrying unexpected authority. "Anyone who spent even a day in her company would know she's not motivated by financial gain." A surprised hush fell over the table. Zachariah Whitfield, known for his reclusiveness, was not only attending a social function but defending the new arrival. Nora's eyes met his across the table, filled with gratitude. "Mr. Whitfield saved my life," she said to the group. "I owe him everything." "Hardly everything," Zachariah demurred, uncomfortable with the attention. "It was Providence that brought you together," declared Reverend Harper, the town's Methodist minister. "God's hand at work." Zachariah wasn't so sure about divine intervention, but he couldn't deny the strange sense of rightness he felt in Nora's presence, as though a piece long missing had unexpectedly been restored. After dinner, while the men retired for brandy and cigars, Zachariah slipped outside onto the porch. The night air was cool against his face as he gazed out at the lights of Butt below. "Escaping." Nora's voice came from behind him. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, the lamplight silhouetting her figure. "Just needed some air. You should be inside with your guests." "They're hardly my guests," she said, joining him at the railing. "More like curious onlookers at an exhibition," Zachariah chuckled. "You handled them admirably." "Thanks to you." She studied his profile. "You didn't have to defend me to Mrs. Sullivan." "She was out of line," he said simply. Nora was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "More memories are returning. I remember teaching, just as she said, young women from good families, preparing them for society or marriage." A wistful smile curved her lips. "I loved it, despite the meager salary." "You'll have means now," Zachariah observed. "You could open your own school if you wanted." Nora considered this, her eyes on the distant mountains. "Perhaps, though I'm not sure I'll stay in but. The thought of her leaving created an unexpected hollow feeling in Zachariah's chest. No. I hardly know this place, she said softly, or myself for that matter. A comfortable silence settled between them. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonesome howl echoing across the valley. Why did you say it? Nora asked suddenly. By the creek when you found me. Wake up, I need you to stay. Why those words? Zachariah stared out at the darkness, struggling with how to answer. The truth was he hardly knew himself. I thought you were dying, he finally said. It seemed important that you didn't. Is that all? Her voice was gentle, encouraging. He turned to face her, finding her closer than expected. I've been alone a long time, Miss Thornton, by choice, but when I saw you there. He shook his head, unable to articulate the complex emotions he'd felt. It just came out. Nora's gaze was steady, searching his face. I'm glad it did, she said simply. I think I heard you, even in the darkness. Something pulled me back. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Zachariah was acutely aware of how improper it would be to act on the impulse growing within him. She was a lady of means now, and he was just a solitary rancher with a past best forgotten. The moment was broken by the drawing room doors opening, spilling light and voices onto the porch. Ah, there you are, Miss Thornton, Sullivan called. The Hendersons are leaving and wish to say good night. Nora stepped back, a fleeting look of regret crossing her face. Duty calls, she murmured. Zachariah nodded, donning his hat. I should be going as well. Will I see you again? There was a vulnerability in her question that touched him deeply. I'm easy enough to find, he said with a small smile. Just follow Elk Creek about 5 miles east. She returned his smile. Perhaps I will. As Zachariah rode home under the star-filled sky, he wondered what sort of foolishness had possessed him. Nora Thornton was educated, refined, and now wealthy. Once she fully recovered her memory, she would have no reason to think twice about a man like him, a man with blood on his hands and nightmares that still woke him shouting. Yet he couldn't forget the way she'd looked at him on that porch, as if she saw something in him worth knowing. 3 days passed without word from the Thornton house. Zachariah threw himself into ranch work, repairing fences and tracking down strays, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest each time he returned to an empty cabin. On the 4th day, as he was chopping firewood, the sound of an approaching horse made him pause, axe in mid-swing. Shielding his eyes against the afternoon sun, he was surprised to see Nora riding toward him on a dapple gray mare, dressed in a practical riding habit, her hair braided simply down her back. She reined in near the woodpile, a smile lighting her face. Good afternoon, Mr. Whitfield. Miss Thornton, he acknowledged, suddenly conscious of his sweat-soaked shirt and unshaven jaw. This is unexpected. I hope not unwelcome. There was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Never that, he assured her, setting down the axe. Just surprised, it's quite a ride from town. Nora dismounted with practiced ease. I needed to escape. Everyone in Butte seems to want something from me, investment in this, patronage for that. It's overwhelming. Zachariah nodded in understanding. And your memory has more returned in pieces, she confirmed. I remember my childhood in Boston, my years at the Ladies' Academy, teaching in Philadelphia. But there are still gaps. And your parents, a shadow crossed her face. They died in a fire when I was 18. That's when I began teaching necessity rather than choice, initially. Uncle Edward sent money occasionally, but I was determined to support myself. Zachariah admired her independence. Would you like some coffee? It's not fancy, but it's hot. I'd love some, she said, following him to the cabin porch where 2 rough-hewn chairs faced the valley. As Zachariah prepared the coffee inside, He was acutely aware of Nora examining his sparse living quarters, the neatly made bed, the small bookshelf with its handful of well-worn volumes, the rifle mounted above the door. "You keep a tidy home," she observed when he returned with 2 steaming cups. "Force of habit from army days," he explained, taking the chair beside her. "Not much need for fancy when it's just me." Nora sipped her coffee, her gaze sweeping across the landscape before them, rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, the creek winding like a silver ribbon through the valley floor. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "Peaceful. That's why I chose it." She studied him with curious eyes. "You prefer solitude?" Zachariah considered the question. "I'm accustomed to it," he said finally. "After the war, after Texas, being alone seemed safer." "Safer for whom?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "For everyone, I suppose." Nora's gaze was penetrating, as if she could see through the careful walls he'd built. "What happened in Texas? Zach?" No one had called him that in years, and hearing it from her lips loosened something in his chest. Before he quite knew what was happening, words began spilling out how he'd ridden with the Texas Rangers after the war, hunting outlaws along the border, until one terrible night when bad intelligence had led them to raid the wrong ranch. "There was a family there," he said, his voice hollow with remembered horror. "Mexican settlers, completely innocent. In the confusion, shots were fired. A boy died, couldn't have been more than 12. He stared into his coffee cup. "I wasn't the one who shot him, but I was there. Part of it." Nora's hand came to rest gently on his forearm. "So you left," he nodded. "Came north as far from Texas as I could get, built this place, tried to live quiet. Alone," she said, understanding in her voice. "It seemed best." Zachariah finally looked at her. "Until I found you by that creek." Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, recognition, perhaps, of 2 souls who had both lost their way and were somehow finding their path again. "I should confess something," Nora said, breaking the silence. "I remember more about why I came to Butt than I've admitted to Mr. Sullivan." Zachariah raised an eyebrow, waiting. Uncle Edward's letter mentioned not just the inheritance, but concerns about the management of his mining interests. Her expression grew troubled. "He hinted at irregularities, possibly fraud, but was vague about details. He wanted me to come in person to discuss it." "And you think Sullivan might be involved?" Nora sighed. "I don't know. He's been nothing but helpful, and yet—" "You don't fully trust him," Zachariah finished for her. "Is that terrible of me?" "It's sensible," he assured her. "Especially given the circumstances of your arrival, if the stage robbery wasn't random." Nora's eyes widened with realization. "You think someone might have targeted me specifically?" "Because of what I might discover about Uncle Edward's business." Zachariah's expression grew grim. "It's worth considering. Copper mining brings enormous profits. If someone's been skimming or mismanaging funds, they might go to great lengths to prevent exposure," Nora concluded, a shiver running through her despite the warm afternoon. "The problem is, I don't know what I'm looking for. I'm a teacher, not a businesswoman." "But you're smart and observant," Zachariah said. "And now they know you're under my protection." Nora's face softened. "Am I? Under your protection?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond mere physical safety. Zachariah found himself unable to look away from her, from the hope and something deeper shining in her eyes. "Yes," he said simply, "for as long as you want to be." Her hand still rested on his arm, warm through the fabric of his shirt. "What if that's a very long time?" Zachariah felt something long dormant stirring in his heart, something he'd believed had died in Texas years ago. "Then I'd consider myself fortunate," he answered honestly. The smile that illuminated Nora's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. For a breathless moment, Zachariah thought she might lean toward him, that he might finally discover if her lips were as soft as they appeared. Instead, a distant rumble of hoofbeats shattered the moment. Both turned to see a cloud of dust on the trail from town, at least 3 riders approaching at speed. Zachariah was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Get inside," he told Nora, his voice leaving no room for argument. For once, she didn't question him, hurrying into the cabin as Zachariah positioned himself on the porch, partially shielded by a support post. As the riders drew closer, he recognized James Sullivan in the lead, accompanied by the town marshal and another man he didn't know. "Whitfield," Sullivan called, reining in before the cabin. "Is Miss Thornton here? Her horse is gone from the stable and no one's seen her since morning." Zachariah relaxed slightly but kept his hand near his weapon. "She's here. She's fine." Relief washed over Sullivan's florid face. "Thank God, when she disappeared without word after everything that's happened." The cabin door opened behind Zachariah and Nora stepped out, her posture straight and composed despite the interruption. "Mr. Sullivan, I apologize for causing concern. I simply needed some air and time to think." Sullivan dismounted, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "My dear Miss Thornton, while I understand the need for solitude, a woman in your position cannot simply vanish without explanation. It's not proper, especially to ride out alone to a bachelor's residence." Color rose in Nora's cheeks. "I wasn't aware I needed permission to move about freely, Mr. Sullivan. As for propriety, your reputation is at stake," Sullivan interrupted. "As your uncle's lawyer and friend, I must consider what he would want." Zachariah stepped forward, irritation rising. "Miss Thornton is quite capable of making her own decisions." The marshal, a grizzled man named Hargrove, spoke up. "No one's suggesting otherwise, Whitfield, but there are still those robbers at large and Miss Thornton's already been attacked once." "Actually," the third man said, speaking for the first time, "that's another reason we came looking for you both." He stepped forward, offering his hand to Zachariah. "Thomas Weber, Pinkerton Detective Agency. I've been tracking the Harker gang for 3 months." Zachariah shook the man's hand, reassessing him. Weber was younger than he'd initially appeared, perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and the watchful demeanor of a man accustomed to danger. "The stage robbery was their work?" Zachariah asked. Weber nodded. "Almost certainly. And they've been spotted again, less than 20 miles from here." Nora moved closer to Zachariah, almost unconsciously seeking his proximity. "What do they want?" Weber exchanged glances with Sullivan. "Information suggests they might be working for someone else, someone with interest in Thornton mining shares." Sullivan's face reddened. "Preposterous. Edward's business dealings were entirely legitimate." "Perhaps," Weber conceded. "But Miss Thornton's inheritance makes her a person of significant interest to certain parties. Until we apprehend the gang and determine who they're working for, she remains at risk." "Then she should return to town immediately," Sullivan insisted, "where she can be properly protected." Zachariah looked at Nora, seeing the conflict in her eyes. He wanted to argue that she was safe with him, that he could protect her better than anyone in Butte, but he knew Sullivan had a point about her reputation. A single woman staying at his cabin would spark gossip that could damage her standing in the community she was just joining. "It's your decision," he told her quietly. Nora straightened her shoulders. "I'll return to town," she said finally, "but on one condition. Mr. Whitfield comes as well as my personal security." Sullivan sputtered. "That's hardly non-negotiable," Nora stated firmly. "He saved my life once already. I trust him completely." The declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that went far beyond physical protection. Zachariah felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest at her words. "Very well," Sullivan conceded reluctantly. "If that's what it takes to ensure your safety and return to town." As they prepared to leave, Zachariah quickly gathered essentials: extra ammunition, a change of clothes, the book he'd been reading. This sudden change of circumstances was unwelcome, but the prospect of remaining close to Nora made it bearable. Outside, as the others mounted up, Nora paused beside him. "I'm sorry to disrupt your solitude," she said softly. "Some disruptions are worth it," he replied, helping her onto her horse. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Zachariah knew with absolute certainty that whatever dangers awaited in Butte, whatever mysteries surrounded Edward Thornton's business and Nora's attack, he would face them all willingly, because somehow, in the space of less than a week, this woman had become more important to him than his carefully constructed isolation. As they rode toward town, the sun beginning its descent behind the western mountains, Zachariah found himself hoping, for the first time in years, for something more than mere survival. The Thornton house seemed different with Zachariah, in it less a museum of her uncle's life and more a place where Nora could imagine building her own. He took a small room off the kitchen, insisting it was more than adequate despite Mrs. Sullivan's pinched expression at having a common rancher residing in one of Butte's finest homes. In the days that followed, they fell into an unexpected routine. Mornings found them reviewing Edward Thornton's papers in the study ledgers, correspondence, mining reports, searching for anything that might explain his cryptic warnings. Afternoons often involved meetings with mine managers or visits to Edward's various business interests in town, with Zachariah, a silent, watchful presence at Nora's side. What surprised Nora most was how quickly she came to rely on Zachariah's quiet strength and practical wisdom. Despite his limited formal education, he possessed a natural intelligence and insight that often cut straight to the heart of matters that left her confused. "Your uncle was tracking these shipments separately," he noted one morning, comparing two ledgers. "See how the amounts don't match the official records?" Nora leaned over his shoulder, acutely aware of his clean, masculine scent soap and leather and something uniquely him. "You're right. But why would he keep two sets of books?" "Not two sets," Zachariah corrected. "This one's his personal record, checking against the official one. He was verifying something." The discovery led them to a locked cabinet in Edward's bedroom, which contained correspondence with a geological survey team that had assessed a new section of his mine, a section rich in a rare mineral used in steel production. Far more valuable than the copper everyone assumed was his primary interest. He kept this secret, Nora realized, scanning the reports. "But why?" "Because knowledge is power," came Weber's voice from the doorway. The Pinkerton detective had taken to stopping by regularly, sharing information about his hunt for the Harker gang while gathering what they learned about Edward's business dealings. Weber entered the room, accepting the documents Nora handed him. If others knew about this mineral deposit, they might try to claim it or manipulate share prices. "Or eliminate the owner," Zachariah added grimly. Nora felt a chill at his words. "You think Uncle Edward was murdered?" Weber shrugged. "His death was reported as natural heart failure. But if someone wanted his mining interests badly enough..." The implication hung heavy in the air. Nora looked to Zachariah, finding his steady gaze already on her. "Who benefits most from your uncle's death?" he asked quietly. "Besides me," Nora attempted a weak smile. "The other major shareholders, I suppose. There's a consortium led by Frederick Donnelly. He owns the smelting works and several smaller mines." "Donnelly," Weber repeated thoughtfully. He's been pressing you to sell your shares, hasn't he? Nora nodded, rather insistently. He claims consolidation would benefit everyone, make operations more efficient, and put the most valuable section entirely under his control, Zachariah concluded. Weber gathered the papers. I'll look into Donnelly's connections, if there's a link between him and the Harker gang. Be careful, Nora warned. He's influential but influence doesn't intimidate the Pinkertons, madam, Weber replied with a tight smile. Besides, we're close to catching the gang. One of my informants spotted them at a camp 10 miles north. After Weber departed, Nora found herself restless, the walls of the house suddenly oppressive. I need air, she announced, and perspective. Zachariah nodded in understanding. The garden. The extensive gardens behind the house had become their refuge, private enough for candid conversation, yet open enough to spot any approach. They walked side by side along gravel paths between late summer blooms, neither speaking until they reached a stone bench beneath an apple tree. Sometimes I wonder if I should simply sell everything and return east, Nora admitted as they sat. Teaching was straightforward, challenging in its way, but never dangerous. Is that what you want? Zachariah's voice was carefully neutral. Nora studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the watchful eyes that missed nothing. A week ago, perhaps. Now, she hesitated. Now I'm not certain what I want, except that running away feels wrong. Because of your uncle, partly, she acknowledged. If he was murdered, he deserves justice, but also because. She faltered, suddenly shy. Zachariah turned to face her, something vulnerable in his expression. Because I've found unexpected connections here, she said softly. To this place, to certain people. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Zachariah's gaze dropped briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. Nora, he began, his voice lower than usual, I'm not a man with much to offer. My life is simple by design, but these past days have changed things, she finished for him. For me as well. He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and covered her hand with his own. The contact sent warmth spiraling through her, both comforting and exhilarating. Whatever you decide, he said. Whether you stay in Butte or return east, I want. A sharp crack split the air, and bark exploded from the tree trunk inches above their heads. Zachariah reacted instantly, pulling Nora to the ground and shielding her body with his own as another shot rang out. Rifle, he murmured against her ear, his body tense as he drew his revolver. From the ridge beyond the garden wall, fear coursed through Nora, not for herself but for him. Zach, stay down, he ordered, then shouted toward the house. Shoot her on the ridge. The house erupted with activity, the gardener running for cover, a kitchen maid screaming, the butler appearing with a shotgun. No more shots came, but Zachariah kept Nora protected until Weber and 2 deputies arrived minutes later, having heard the gunfire from the street. Harker gang? Weber asked as they examined the bullet holes in the tree. Zachariah shook his head. Too precise. These weren't warning shots, they were aimed to kill. A professional. Nora, still shaken, looked between the men. Because of what we discovered about the mineral deposits, likely, Weber agreed. Someone's getting nervous. That evening, after the house had been thoroughly searched and guards posted, Nora found Zachariah on the back porch, cleaning his revolver by lamplight. His expression was distant, troubled in a way she hadn't seen before. You're leaving, aren't you? She asked softly, sitting beside him. He looked up, surprised. What makes you say that? Your face. You have the look of a man preparing to ride out. Zachariah set the gun aside with a sigh. Not leaving you, he clarified, but this waiting game isn't working. Someone tried to kill you today, Nora. Next time they might succeed. Fear clutched at her heart. What are you planning? To find Donnelly's connection to the Harker gang, if there is one. Weber's focusing on the gang itself, but the real threat is whoever's giving the orders. And you'll do this how? A dangerous smile touched his lips. I wasn't always a quiet rancher. I know how to track, how to find information people don't want found. Nora reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. No, it's too dangerous. More dangerous to wait for another attempt, he countered. If something happened to you, he broke off, unable to complete the thought. The raw emotion in his voice cracked something open inside Nora. Without conscious thought, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. For an instant, Zachariah went completely still. Then his hand came up to cradle the back of her head, and he was kissing her back with a gentle intensity that made her heart race. It was a kiss of revelation, of barriers falling and truths acknowledged. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Zachariah rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since I found you by that creek, he admitted hoarsely. Then why didn't you? She whispered. Because you deserve better than a man with my past. Because your life is in Boston or Philadelphia, not some ranch in Montana territory. Nora pulled back slightly to look into his eyes. Shouldn't I be the one to decide what I deserve, what I want? The vulnerability in his expression nearly broke her heart. And what do you want, Nora Thornton? Time, she answered honestly. Time to know this place, to understand my uncle's legacy. And time with you, Zachariah Whitfield, to discover if what I feel is as real and lasting as I believe it to be. Hope and hesitation warred in his features. And if it is, then we'll face that future together, she said simply. But we need to survive the present first, which means no heroic solo missions against Donnelly or anyone else. Zachariah's thumb traced the curve of her cheek. You're a formidable negotiator, Miss Thornton. I taught young ladies how to secure advantageous marriages, she reminded him with a smile. I picked up a few skills. His laugh was warm and genuine, a sound she'd heard too rarely. Very well. We approach this together, but cautiously. Agreed, agreed. She sealed the pact with another kiss, briefer but no less meaningful. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Nora realized that despite the danger, despite the uncertainty, she felt more alive, more herself than she had in years. Whatever came next, she would face it with this man beside her, this unexpected gift the creek had brought into her life. The next morning brought a surprising visitor to the Thornton house. Frederick Donnelly himself arrived shortly after breakfast, his expensive suit and gold watch chain advertising his prosperity. He was a large man with a carefully groomed beard and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. Miss Thornton, he boomed as the butler showed him into the drawing room. I came as soon as I heard about yesterday's unfortunate incident. Are you unharmed? Nora rose to greet him, keeping her expression neutral despite her inner wariness. Quite well, thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Just a bit shaken. Donnelly's gaze shifted to Zachariah, who stood by the window, his posture relaxed but alert. Mr. Whitfield, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. No need for formalities, Zachariah replied evenly. I know who you are. A flicker of annoyance crossed Donnelly's face before his affable mask returned. Well, I've heard about you, the hero who rescued our Miss Thornton. The town owes you a debt. Please sit, Nora intervened, gesturing to a chair. What brings you here this morning, Mr. Donnelly? Donnelly settled his bulk into a chair that seemed too delicate for his frame. Concern for your safety, primarily. These attacks are most disturbing. Indeed, Nora agreed, especially in light of our discoveries about Uncle Edward's special mining section. It was a calculated gamble, revealing their knowledge, but Nora wanted to gauge Donnelly's reaction. She wasn't disappointed. A momentary tightening around his eyes betrayed his surprise before he recovered. "Ah, you found Edward's geological surveys," he said smoothly. "I wondered if those would turn up. Your uncle was quite secretive about that particular vein." "With good reason, it seems," Zachariah commented. "That deposit is worth a fortune." Donnelly spread his hands in a gesture of openness. "Which is precisely why I've been encouraging Miss Thornton to consider selling her shares to our consortium. Managing such valuable resources requires experience, connections, capital. All of which my uncle possessed," Nora pointed out. "And as his heir, I have access to the same resources." "My dear Miss Thornton," Donnelly's tone became paternal, "mining is a rough business, not suited to a woman of your refinement. Yesterday's violence only underscores the dangers." Nora felt her temper rising at his condescension. "Are you suggesting the attempt on my life was related to my gender rather than my ownership of valuable property?" Donnelly's smile thinned. "I'm suggesting that certain elements might see you as an easier target than your uncle, which brings me to my proposal." He leaned forward earnestly. "Sell to us now, at a premium price 20% above market value. You can return east with a fortune, safe from these threats. And if I decline, then I fear the dangers may increase," Donnelly replied, his voice softening with what seemed like genuine concern. "Not by my hand, I assure you, but there are ruthless operators in the territory." From his position by the window, Zachariah spoke. "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Donnelly." The businessman's head snapped toward him. "A warning, Mr. Whitfield. There's a distinction." "Not from where I stand," Zachariah replied coolly. Tension crackled in the room as the two men stared at each other. Nora rose, signaling an end to the meeting. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Donnelly, but I'll need time to consider all my options." Donnelly stood, straightening his waistcoat. "Of course, but I urge you not to delay too long. My offer won't remain open indefinitely." He reached for his hat. "And do be careful, Miss Thornton. Montana can be unforgiving to those who don't understand its ways." After he departed, Nora turned to Zachariah, her heart racing. "He as good as admitted involvement." "Not enough to prove anything," Zachariah said grimly, "but enough to convince me." "He wants me scared and running back east," Nora realized, "willing to sell at any price just to escape." Zachariah moved to her side. "Are you scared?" She considered the question honestly. "Yes," she admitted, "but not enough to run." Pride and something deeper warmed his gaze. "Good, because I have a plan." That evening, Weber joined them in Edward's study to hear Zachariah's proposal. "We need to force Donnelly's hand," Zachariah explained, spreading a map across the desk. "Make him reveal his connection to the Harker gang." Weber nodded thoughtfully. "And how do we accomplish that?" "By giving him exactly what he wants apparently." Zachariah looked to Nora. "You'll announce that you're selling your shares and returning east." Nora caught on quickly. "But actually set a trap." "Precisely." Zachariah traced a route on the map. "You'll take the eastbound stage, but only as far as Silver Creek. I'll be following at a distance. If the Harker gang attacks the stage, we'll be waiting," Weber finished, "with enough men to capture them all. And if we're right about Donnelly being behind this," Zachariah continued, "he might even show up himself to make sure the job is done right this time." Nora felt a chill at the calculated risk they were discussing. "And if we're wrong, then you're safely on your way east with a detachment of Pinkertons for protection," Weber assured her. "No harm done." "Except abandoning my uncle's legacy," she pointed out. Zachariah's expression softened. "No one would blame you for leaving, Nora, after everything that's happened." She met his gaze steadily. "I would blame myself. Besides, we both know I'm not actually going anywhere." The corners of his mouth lifted slightly. "No," No, she confirmed, her decision crystallizing in that moment. Whatever happens, my future is here now. The look that passed between them communicated everything words couldn't hope, promise, commitment. Weber cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. Well then, the detective said, let's make sure you have a future to claim, Miss Thornton. We'll need to move quickly. The stage leaves for Helena day after tomorrow. The next day passed in a flurry of carefully orchestrated activity. Nora publicly visited the bank to arrange for the transfer of funds. She called on Mrs. Sullivan to tearfully explain her decision to return east, ensuring the news would spread rapidly. She even met with Donnelly's lawyer to indicate preliminary acceptance of his offer, contingent on final paperwork being completed in Helena. By evening, all of Butt knew that Nora Thornton had surrendered to fear and was abandoning her uncle's legacy. In the privacy of her home, however, preparations of a different sort were underway. Zachariah and Weber pored over maps, planning positions for the Pinkerton men who would shadow the stage. Nora packed a small valise with practical clothing rather than the fine dresses everyone would expect her to take east. As darkness fell, she found Zachariah alone in the garden, his face turned toward the stars. Having second thoughts, she asked, joining him. He shook his head. Just making peace with what might come. If Donnelly is behind this, tomorrow won't be without risk. For all of us, she acknowledged. Zach, if anything happens, it won't, he interrupted, turning to face her. In the moonlight, his features were cast in silver and shadow, more handsome than any man had a right to be. I won't let it. Nora stepped closer, resting her hands against his chest. Some things can't be controlled, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. His arms came around her waist, drawing her against him. Then know this, he said, his voice low and intense. Finding you by that creek was the best thing that ever happened to me. Whatever comes tomorrow, I don't regret a moment since. The simple declaration touched her more deeply than flowery words or grand promises could have. Rising on tiptoe, Nora pressed her lips to his in a kiss that conveyed everything she felt: fear for tomorrow, gratitude for his presence in her life, and the love that had grown between them, unexpected but undeniable. When they parted, breathless, Zachariah rested his forehead against hers. When this is over, he murmured, we should talk about the future, our future. Hope bloomed in Nora's heart. I'd like that very much. They stood together under the vast Montana sky, two souls who had found each other against all odds, holding fast to a promise of tomorrow. Dawn broke clear and cold on the day of Nora's supposed departure. The stage was scheduled to leave at 8 o'clock, and by 7:30, a small gathering had assembled to see her off. Sullivan and his wife, Reverend Harper, several business associates of her uncle's, and even Frederick Donnelly himself, looking satisfied despite his outward expressions of regret. Nora played her role perfectly, dressed in a traveling suit with a veiled hat that partially obscured her face. She accepted condolences on her unfortunate experience in Butt with gracious resignation, repeatedly expressing her desire to return to the familiarity of the East. Such a shame, Mrs. Sullivan sighed. You've hardly had time to know your uncle's home. Some experiences, however brief, leave lasting impressions, Nora replied, her gaze drifting to where Zachariah stood apart from the crowd, ostensibly there as her security until departure. Donnelly approached as the driver began loading luggage. Miss Thornton, I want to assure you that our agreement will be honored to the letter. My representative will meet you in Helena with the final documents. Thank you, Mr. Donnelly, Nora said coolly. I'll hold you to that. Something in her tone made his eyes narrow slightly, but the arrival of the stage prevented further conversation. As the driver called for passengers, Nora made her farewells, saving Zachariah for last. "Mr. Whitfield," she said formally, extending her hand. "I can't thank you enough for your protection these past weeks." Zachariah took her hand, and even through her gloves, Nora felt the warm pressure of his fingers, a silent promise. "Safe journey, Miss Thornton," he said, his eyes conveying what his words could not. With a final nod to the assembled crowd, Nora boarded the stage, settling into a corner seat as two other passengers, both Pinkerton men disguised as ordinary travelers, joined her. As the stage lurched forward, she caught a last glimpse of Zachariah, standing straight and watchful, before Butt fell behind them. The journey began uneventfully, the stage following the main road east from Butt. Nora knew that Weber and 3 of his men rode ahead, while Zachariah and 2 others followed at a distance. The trap was set, but would it be sprung? 2 hours into the journey, as they entered a narrow pass between towering rock formations, Nora got her answer. The sharp crack of rifle fire split the air, and the stage driver shouted in alarm. The coach lurched violently as the horses panicked, then came to an abrupt halt. "Everybody out," came a harsh voice from outside. "Hands where we can see them." The Pinkerton men exchanged glances with Nora, their hands moving toward concealed weapons. This was the moment they'd anticipated, but something felt wrong. The voice had come from the direction Weber and his men should have been positioned. As they cautiously exited the stage, Nora's blood ran cold. 5 men with bandanas covering their faces had rifles trained on them, but Weber and his advance team were nowhere to be seen. One of the bandits stepped forward, eyes hard above his mask. "Nora Thornton," he stated rather than asked. "You'll be coming with us." The Pinkerton men moved to shield her, drawing their weapons, but they were outnumbered. In the chaos that erupted, Nora did the only thing she could. She ran, scrambling up the rocky slope beside the road, her heavy skirts hampering her progress, but adrenaline driving her forward. Gunfire echoed through the pass behind her. Nora didn't look back, focusing solely on escape. If she could reach the ridge, perhaps she could find Weber and his men, or signal Zachariah somehow. She had nearly reached the top when a figure appeared before her. Frederick Donnelly, a hunting rifle in his hands and no mask to conceal his identity. "This is becoming tiresome, Miss Thornton," he said coldly. "I offered you a civilized solution." Nora backed away, heart pounding. "You killed my uncle," Donnelly shrugged. "Edward became inconvenient, as have you." He raised the rifle. "Unfortunately, the Harker gang will be blamed for another tragic robbery gone wrong." "Will they?" came Zachariah's voice from behind Donnelly. "Seems unlikely, given the witnesses." Donnelly spun to find Zachariah aiming a revolver steadily at his chest. Relief flooded through Nora, quickly replaced by fresh fear as Donnelly swung his rifle toward Zachariah instead. "Drop it," Zachariah commanded, his voice deadly calm. "It's over, Donnelly." For a tense moment, Nora was certain Donnelly would fire anyway. Then, unexpectedly, he lowered the rifle with a hollow laugh. "You think you've won?" he asked bitterly. "You think any court in Montana will convict Frederick Donnelly on the word of a drifter and a woman?" "Perhaps not," Zachariah conceded. "But the Pinkerton report detailing your association with known criminals might persuade them. As might the evidence of your financial troubles that drove you to target Edward Thornton's special mining section." Surprise flickered across Donnelly's face. "How did you? Unlike you, we did our research thoroughly," Nora interjected. "My uncle kept excellent records, including correspondence about your desperate attempts to buy into his operation." From below came the sound of more gunfire, then shouting as Weber's men finally arrived, having been delayed by an ambush set by Donnelly's hired guns. Donnelly's shoulders slumped in defeat. As Zachariah moved forward to secure him, Nora felt the tension of the past weeks finally begin to uncoil. It wasn't over yet. There would be statements to give, evidence to present, a trial to face, but the immediate danger had passed. When Weber and his men had taken Donnelly and the captured members of the Harker gang into custody, Zachariah finally turned to Nora. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he might never let go. "For a moment there," he said roughly against her hair, "when I saw him pointing that rifle at you." Nora pressed closer, feeling his heart pounding against hers. "But you were there. Just as I knew you would be." He drew back slightly to look into her face, his expression more open and vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "I'll always be there, Nora, if you'll have me." In answer, she kissed him, there on the rocky hillside with the Montana sky stretching endlessly above them, no longer caring who might see or what they might think. "Is that a yes?" Zachariah asked when they finally parted, a smile tugging at his lips. "That's a yes," she confirmed. "To whatever future we build together." 2 months later, as the first snows of winter dusted the mountains around Butte, Nora stood in the parlor of the Thornton house, now the Whitfield house, and watched her husband hang a painting on the wall. Much had changed since that dramatic day on the stage road. Frederick Donnelly had been charged with murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy, his empire crumbling as evidence of his crimes mounted. The Harker gang had been disbanded, some members imprisoned, others fled to parts unknown. Nora had assumed full control of her uncle's mining interests, implementing reforms that improved safety and workers' conditions while maintaining profitability. She'd also started a small school for miners' children 3 afternoons a week, unable to abandon teaching entirely. And she had married Zachariah in a simple ceremony at the Methodist church, with Weber serving as best man before returning east to his next assignment. "There," Zachariah said, stepping back to admire the painting, a landscape of Elk Creek at sunset, commissioned from a traveling artist. A reminder of where it all began. Nora moved to his side, slipping her arm around his waist, as if we could ever forget. He turned to face her, his expression softening as it always did when they were alone together. No regrets about staying in Butte, about marrying a rancher with a troubled past. Nora reached up to touch his cheek, the familiar contours of his face still a marvel to her. "The only thing I regret is that it took a head injury and attempted murder for us to find each other." Zachariah laughed, the sound still rare enough to delight her. "When you put it that way, it does seem rather dramatic." "Speaking of dramatic," Nora said, taking his hand and placing it gently against her still flat stomach, "I have news." She watched comprehension dawn in his eyes, followed by wonder and then joy so pure it took her breath away. "Nora," he whispered, "are you certain?" She nodded, her own happiness mirrored in his face. "Dr. Morgan confirmed it yesterday. We'll have a child by summer." Zachariah gathered her carefully into his arms as if she had suddenly become fragile. "A child," he repeated, awe in his voice. "Our child." "The first of several, I hope," Nora said, smiling against his chest. "As many as you want," he promised, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Outside, snow began to fall more heavily, blanketing Butte in pristine white. Inside the warmth of their home, Zachariah and Nora Whitfield stood entwined, the family they were creating, a testament to the words spoken beside a creek many months before. "Wake up. I need you to stay." She had stayed, and in doing so, had found everything she never knew she was seeking: purpose, home, love, and a future bright with promise. All because a solitary cowboy had happened upon an unconscious woman and couldn't bear to let her go. As spring blossomed across the Montana landscape, bringing wildflowers to the meadows and new leaves to the aspen groves, Nora's condition became increasingly evident. Her slender frame now supported a noticeable roundness that Zachariah found utterly captivating, often catching himself staring at her with undisguised wonder. They had settled into a rhythm of life that suited them both, Zachariah dividing his time between the small ranch he maintained and helping oversee the Thornton mining interests, while Nora managed the business affairs and continued her teaching several afternoons each week. Their evenings were spent together in the comfortable study, reading aloud to each other or simply talking about their days. On this particular April morning, Nora stood on the porch, watching Zachariah work with a young colt in the paddock nearby. His patience with the nervous animal reminded her of his gentle persistence with her during those early days of her recovery, never pushing, always supportive, giving her space to find her way back to herself. "Penny, for your thoughts," came a familiar voice. Nora turned to find Elizabeth Weber approaching, her arms full of spring flowers. Thomas Weber's sister had arrived in Butte shortly after their marriage, having accepted Nora's invitation to become her companion and assistant. The two women had quickly formed a friendship that benefited them, both, Elizabeth finding purpose after years of caring for their ailing mother, and Nora gaining a confidante who understood the challenges of being an independent woman in the West. "Just appreciating the view," Nora replied with a smile, gesturing toward her husband. Elizabeth laughed, her practical nature one of her most endearing qualities. "He is rather nice to look at, your cowboy, though I suspect you appreciate far more than his appearance." "Indeed I do," Nora agreed, helping Elizabeth arrange the flowers in a vase. "Any word from Thomas?" "A telegram arrived yesterday. He's in Denver now, still chasing bank robbers. Says he may visit in June if his case concludes successfully." Nora nodded, pleased. Perfect timing. The baby should arrive in early July, according to Dr. Morgan. Elizabeth's expression softened. "You're radiant, you know. Motherhood suits you, even before the child arrives." Nora placed a hand on her rounded belly, feeling the gentle flutter of movement within. "I never imagined this life for myself. Teaching was to be my path, perhaps eventually becoming a headmistress at a ladies' school. And now I can't imagine any other life," Nora said simply, "even with all its complications." Those complications had not disappeared entirely with Donnelly's arrest. The trial had been difficult, with Donnelly's remaining allies attempting to discredit both Nora and Zachariah. In the end, justice had prevailed, but the experience had taught them that building their future in Butte would require continued vigilance and determination. Zachariah approached from the paddock, removing his gloves as he climbed the porch steps. "Ladies," he greeted them, bending to place a quick kiss on Nora's cheek. "Those flowers brighten the place considerably." "As do pleasant companions," Elizabeth replied with a smile. "I'll just put these in water and then see about lunch." As she disappeared inside, Zachariah took Nora's hand, leading her to the porch swing. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his free hand gently resting on her belly. "Wonderful," she assured him. "We both are." A look of amazement crossed his face as he felt a definite kick against his palm. "Strong," he observed. "Like his mother." "Or her father," Nora countered with a smile. "We still haven't decided on names." They had been debating possibilities for weeks: Edward for a boy after her uncle, Grace for a girl after his mother. "Plenty of time for that," Zachariah said, his thumb tracing circles on her hand. "First, I have news." Nora recognized the look in his eyes, a combination of excitement and apprehension that usually preceded a significant announcement. "Good news, I hope." "I believe so." I've received an offer for my cabin and the surrounding acreage. A fair price, more than fair actually. Surprise rippled through Nora. Although they lived primarily at the Thornton house in town, Zachariah had maintained his small ranch, visiting several times a week to tend to his horses and cattle. She knew the solitude there restored something in him that the bustle of Butte sometimes depleted. "Are you considering accepting?" she asked carefully. He nodded, watching her face. "I've been thinking about our future, the baby, your school, the mining business. My cabin is too far from everything that matters now." Warmth bloomed in Nora's chest at his words. "Zach, I would never ask you to give up your place. I know what it means to you." "That's just it," he said, squeezing her hand. "It was a refuge when I needed one, a place to heal after Texas, but now—" His gaze softened as it rested on her. "Now my home is wherever you are." Emotion tightened Nora's throat. "You're sure?" "Completely," he assured her. "Besides, I've been looking at a property closer to town, 20 acres with good water and pasturage, just a 15-minute ride from here. We could build something new there, something that's ours from the beginning." The thought was appealing, a place that reflected both of them, neither hers nor his but truly theirs. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." Relief and pleasure illuminated his face. "Then it's settled. I'll accept the offer and begin negotiations for the new land." Nora leaned against him, contentment washing through her. "Do you ever wonder at how much has changed in less than a year? Sometimes I feel I should pinch myself to ensure it's not all a dream." Zachariah's arm tightened around her shoulders. "If it is a dream, I hope we never wake from it." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of James Sullivan, looking harried as he hurried up the path to the porch. Despite initial tensions following Donnelly's arrest, Sullivan had proven himself a valuable ally in the subsequent months, his legal expertise helping to stabilize the mining operations. "Mr. Sullivan," Nora greeted him, noting his agitated state. "Is something wrong?" "Potentially," he replied, removing his hat. "There's been an accident at the northern shaft. No fatalities, thank God, but several injuries and significant damage." Zachariah rose immediately. "What kind of accident?" "A collapse in the new section. The one with the special mineral deposits." Nora and Zachariah exchanged concerned glances. That section had been closely guarded since Donnelly's arrest, access limited to trusted workers. "Accident or sabotage?" Zachariah asked bluntly. Sullivan spread his hands helplessly. "Impossible to say yet. The foreman is investigating, but he requested your presence, Mr. Whitfield. Your experience with structural reinforcement might be valuable." Zachariah nodded, already reaching for his hat. He turned to Nora, concern evident in his eyes. "Will you be all right if I go?" "Of course," she assured him, rising awkwardly from the swing. "Elizabeth is here, and Mrs. Peterson is coming this afternoon to discuss expanding the school curriculum." Still, he hesitated. "Promise you'll rest while I'm gone. No traipsing about town on mining business." Nora laughed, touching his cheek affectionately. "I promise to be the very picture of maternal docility." He looked skeptical but bent to kiss her gently. "I'll return as soon as I can," he murmured against her lips. As Zachariah departed with Sullivan, Nora watched until they disappeared from view, a small furrow of worry between her brows. Mining accidents were commonplace, but the timing and location of this one troubled her. Most of Donnelly's associates had distanced themselves after his conviction, but a few remained loyal, potentially harboring grudges. Elizabeth joined her on the porch, sensing her unease. "They'll sort it out," she said confidently. "Zachariah won't take unnecessary risks." Nora nodded, willing herself to believe it. "Of course." Now, shall we review those new geography texts you ordered from Chicago? The children are particularly excited about maps of the territories. The day passed slowly, Nora finding it difficult to concentrate on school plans despite Elizabeth's engaging ideas. By late afternoon, when Zachariah had not returned or sent word, her anxiety had grown substantially. "Perhaps I should ride to the mine," she suggested, pacing the study where they had been working. Elizabeth looked up from her notes, concerned. "Nora, you promised Zachariah you would rest. Besides, a mine after an accident is no place for a woman in your condition." Before Nora could argue further, the sound of hoofbeats on the drive drew her attention. She moved quickly to the window, relief flooding through her at the sight of Zachariah dismounting. Her relief was short-lived, however. Even from a distance, she could see the grim set of his jaw and the dirt and soot covering his clothing. Something was very wrong. Elizabeth, observing her expression, rose to join her at the window. "I'll have cook prepare a hot meal and draw a bath," she said practically. "Whatever news he brings, he'll deliver it better for having his basic needs met." Nora nodded gratefully, then went to meet her husband at the door. Up close, Zachariah looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed and a nasty cut visible on his forearm through his torn sleeve. When Nora reached to touch it, he captured her hand, bringing it to his lips instead. "It's nothing," he assured her. "Barely a scratch." "The accident?" she asked, leading him into the house. His expression darkened. "No accident." The support beams were deliberately damaged, saw marks clear as day. If the shift foreman hadn't noticed unusual creaking and evacuated the men, we'd be dealing with multiple deaths. Cold dread settled in Nora's stomach. Donnelly's remaining supporters. "That's my guess," Zachariah confirmed, accepting the glass of whiskey Elizabeth silently offered before discreetly withdrawing to give them privacy. "That section is the most valuable part of your holdings. Damaging it hurts production and creates fear among the workers." Nora sank onto the sofa, one hand protectively covering her belly. "I thought this was over," she said quietly. "With Donnelly convicted, men like Donnelly rarely act alone," Zachariah reminded her gently, sitting beside her. "He had partners, silent investors who lost considerably when his schemes were exposed." "What do we do?" Zachariah's expression was resolute. "We increase security at the mine. I've already spoken with Marshal Hargrove about investigating everyone who had access to that section." And he hesitated, clearly reluctant to continue. "And," Nora prompted, "and I think you should consider selling that particular section," he finished. "Not the entire mine, just that troublesome vein." Surprise rendered Nora momentarily speechless. "Sell?" "After everything we went through to protect it, your safety matters more than any mine," Zachariah said firmly. "Our child's safety. As long as you own that section, you remain a target." Nora stood, needing movement to process his suggestion. "That section was important to Uncle Edward. Important enough that he kept it secret, that he was possibly murdered for it." "And would he want you risking your life for it?" Zachariah countered, his voice gentle but insistent. "Risking our family," the question struck home. Nora placed both hands on her rounded belly, feeling the child within shift and settle. What was wealth compared to the life growing inside her? What was pride of ownership against the family she and Zachariah were building? Who would buy it? She asked finally. "I won't sell to anyone associated with Donnelly." Relief crossed Zachariah's features as he realized she was considering his proposal. "There's a mining consortium from Denver looking to expand into Montana. Legitimate operators with solid reputations. Sullivan mentioned them last month." Nora nodded slowly. "I'll consider it," she conceded, "but I want assurances about the workers' conditions and continued employment under new ownership." Zachariah smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "I'd expect nothing less from you." He rose, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his injured arm. Nora immediately moved to his side. "Bath first, then I'll tend to that cut properly," she instructed. No arguments, his smile turned tender. "Yes, madam." Later, with Zachariah bathed and his wound properly cleaned and bandaged, they sat together before the fire in their bedroom, the spring night having turned unexpectedly chilly. "I received a letter from my sister today," Nora mentioned, running a brush through her long hair. "She's finally forgiven me for marrying a complete stranger and settling in the wilderness." Zachariah chuckled, watching her from the comfort of an armchair. "Does that mean we can expect a visit from Boston?" "Perhaps next year," Nora said. "She's genuinely curious about our life here, though she tries to hide it beneath concern." "She's worried for her little sister," Zachariah observed. "That's natural." Nora set down her brush, turning to face him. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about home being wherever I am." He nodded, waiting for her to continue. "It's the same for me," she said softly. "When I lost my memory, I was adrift, uncertain of everything except the sense that I could trust you. Even before I remembered who I was, I think my heart recognized where it belonged." Emotion flickered across Zachariah's face. He extended his hand, and Nora moved to perch on the arm of his chair, her fingers intertwining with his. "I spent 5 years trying to outrun my past," he said quietly, "convincing myself I was better off alone. Then I found you by that creek, and suddenly being alone seemed like the worst fate imaginable." Nora leaned down to kiss him, a gentle meeting of lips that deepened as his hand came up to cradle the back of her head. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything," he answered without hesitation. "Promise me that no matter what comes, minds or memories, dangers or doubts, we'll face it together. No more solitary battles." Zachariah's gaze was steady, unwavering in its certainty. "Together," he vowed. "Always." As if in agreement, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly energetic kick that had both of them laughing. "I think our child approves," Nora said, placing Zachariah's hand where he could feel the movement. Wonder softened his features as he felt the strong, insistent nudges against his palm. "Already opinionated," he observed. "Definitely takes after you." Nora swatted his shoulder playfully. "I prefer to think of it as determined, a quality you possess in equal measure, Mr. Whitfield." His smile faded into something more serious, more vulnerable. "Do you ever regret it, being found by a broken man with more ghosts than future?" Nora cupped his face between her hands, ensuring he couldn't look away from the truth in her eyes. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You weren't broken, Zach, just waiting. As was I." In the flickering firelight, with the promise of their child growing between them and the life they'd built surrounding them, Nora knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in Boston or Philadelphia or even Butte, but in the heart of the man who had once pleaded with a stranger to stay. July arrived with a heat wave that had the citizens of Butte seeking shade and cool drinks at every opportunity. For Nora, in the final weeks of her pregnancy, the heat was particularly challenging. She had retreated to the relative coolness of the house, her usual energy dampened by both the temperature and the considerable weight she now carried. Zachariah had become increasingly attentive, rearranging his duties to spend more time at home. The sale of the special mining section had been completed a month earlier, bringing a substantial sum that would ensure their financial security for years to come. More importantly, it had removed the most obvious target from their backs, allowing them to focus on their impending parenthood without constant vigilance. On this sweltering afternoon, Nora was resting in the garden's shade when Elizabeth brought a telegram that had just arrived. "From Thomas," Elizabeth explained, handing her the envelope. "Finally responding to our invitation, I expect." Nora opened it eagerly, then laughed with delight. "He's coming. Says he'll arrive next week and stay through August if that's convenient." Elizabeth's face lit with pleasure. "Wonderful. It's been nearly a year since I've seen him." "And perfect timing with the baby due any day," Nora added. "Another trusted friend nearby will be most welcome." She shifted uncomfortably, trying to find a position that eased the persistent ache in her lower back. It had been troubling her since morning, but she dismissed it as another pregnancy discomfort. Elizabeth noticed her grimace. "Are you feeling unwell?" "Just the usual complaints," Nora assured her. "Dr. Morgan says everything is progressing normally." Elizabeth looked unconvinced but didn't press the issue. "I'll bring some lemonade. Perhaps that will help with the heat at least." As she departed, Nora rubbed her belly gently. "Soon," she murmured to the child within. "Your father is already planning fishing trips and pony rides, though I've told him those are years away." Another twinge, sharper this time, caused her to catch her breath. Perhaps these weren't merely the usual discomforts after all. By the time Elizabeth returned with lemonade, Nora was certain. "I think you should find Zachariah," she said calmly, "and perhaps send for Dr. Morgan as well." Elizabeth's eyes widened in understanding. "The baby." Now, Nora nodded, a mix of excitement and apprehension filling her. "It seems our little one has chosen this scorching day to make an appearance." Elizabeth set down the lemonade with shaking hands. "I'll send Will for Zachariah immediately. He's at the new property, supervising the foundation work, and Mrs. Peterson can fetch the doctor." As Elizabeth hurried away, another contraction gripped Nora, stronger than before. She breathed through it as Dr. Morgan had instructed, focusing on remaining calm. By the time Zachariah arrived, flushed and breathless from riding hard, Nora had been moved to their bedroom, where the housekeeper and Elizabeth were preparing everything needed for the birth. "Nora," Zachariah said, crossing to her side and taking her hand. "Are you all right? Is it truly time?" She smiled at the mixture of panic and wonder in his expression. "Truly time," she confirmed. "Though babies often take their own sweet time about arriving, so we may have hours yet." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a fervent kiss to her knuckles. "I'll be right here," he promised. The whole time. Dr. Morgan, when he arrived 20 minutes later, had other ideas. "I'm afraid that's not customary, Mr. Whitfield," he said firmly. "The birthing room is no place for husbands. You'll only be in the way." Zachariah's jaw set stubbornly. "I've seen men torn apart in battle. I think I can handle childbirth." "It's not a question of what you can handle," the doctor replied, equally stubborn. "It's about what's best for your wife and child." Nora, seeing the brewing confrontation, intervened. "Zach, please," she said softly. "Wait downstairs. Elizabeth will stay with me, and Mrs. Peterson has assisted at dozens of births." Reluctantly, Zachariah allowed himself to be ushered from the room, but not before bending to kiss Nora's forehead. "I'll be just outside if you need me," he murmured. "Remember your promise, we face everything together." As the door closed behind him, Nora felt another contraction beginning. This one was significantly stronger, and she couldn't suppress a small cry of pain. "That's it," Dr. Morgan said approvingly. "Don't try to be stoic. Work with your body, not against it." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and effort, time losing all meaning as Nora's world narrowed to the overwhelming task of bringing her child into the world. Elizabeth remained steadfastly at her side, offering encouragement and comfort, while Dr. Morgan and Mrs. Peterson attended to the medical necessities. Outside, Zachariah paced the hallway like a caged lion, flinching at every sound from within the bedroom. When Thomas Weber unexpectedly arrived, having traveled ahead of his planned visit, he found the former ranger nearly frantic with worry. "She's strong," Weber reminded him, pressing a glass of whiskey into his hand. "And Morgan's the best doctor in 3 territories." Zachariah nodded, too distracted to be surprised by his friend's early appearance. "I know." But hearing her in pain and not being able to help, he broke off as another cry came from behind the closed door. Weber clasped his shoulder sympathetically. "The helplessness is the worst part, but this pain brings joy, unlike the kind we've both seen too much of." As darkness fell, the cries from the bedroom grew more frequent, more intense. Zachariah had abandoned pretense of calm, standing with his forehead pressed against the door, murmuring encouragement Nora couldn't hear. Then, at last, a different cry pierced the night, high and indignant, the unmistakable wail of a newborn announcing its arrival to the world. Zachariah straightened, his face transformed by wonder and relief. Weber grinned, clapping him on the back. "Congratulations, Father." The door finally opened, and Dr. Morgan emerged, looking tired but pleased. "A perfect son, Mr. Whitfield. Mother and child both doing well." Zachariah barely heard the words, already moving past the doctor into the room where his wife and child waited. Nora lay against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as Zachariah approached, her smile soft and triumphant. "Meet your son," she said, her voice hoarse from exertion. "Edward Zachariah Whitfield." Zachariah sank onto the edge of the bed, overcome by emotion as he gazed at the tiny face peeking from the blankets, red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and his mother's determined chin. "He's perfect," Zachariah whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. To his amazement, the infant's fingers curled around his own in a surprisingly strong grip. "Strong like his mother, and stubborn like his father," Nora countered with a tired laugh. "He was certainly in no hurry to arrive." Zachariah leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've never been more proud or more in awe of anyone." Nora's eyes filled with tears of exhaustion and happiness. "Would you like to hold him?" With infinite care, Zachariah gathered his son into his arms, marveling at how such a small being could so completely fill his heart. As he cradled Edward, memories of another life of violence and regret and solitude seemed to recede, replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose and belonging. "Hello, Edward," he said softly. "Welcome to the world. Your mother and I have been waiting for you." The baby yawned, his tiny face scrunching momentarily before relaxing back into sleep, secure in his father's strong arms. Elizabeth, who had been quietly assisting Mrs. Peterson with cleaning up, approached the bed with a cup of broth for Nora. "He's beautiful," she said, admiring the infant. "Thomas is downstairs, beside himself with excitement to meet his honorary nephew." "Thomas is here already?" Nora asked, surprised. "Arrived just hours ago," Zachariah confirmed. "Perfect timing as usual." Nora sipped the broth gratefully. "Please invite him up if Dr. Morgan permits visitors." The doctor, completing his notes by the window, nodded his assent. Briefly, both mother and child need rest soon. The next hour passed in quiet celebration as Thomas joined them, admiring the baby and sharing news of his recent adventures. Throughout it all, Zachariah remained close to Nora, his eyes frequently returning to her face as if to reassure himself of her well-being. When Dr. Morgan finally insisted that Nora needed sleep, Zachariah reluctantly surrendered Edward to the cradle that had been placed beside their bed. The others withdrew, leaving the new family to their privacy. In the stillness that followed, with Edward sleeping peacefully and Nora drowsing beside him, Zachariah felt a profound peace unlike anything he'd known before. Carefully, so as not to disturb her, he stretched out on the bed beside his wife, his hand finding hers even in sleep. "Thank you," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him, "for staying, for everything." As if sensing his thoughts, Nora stirred slightly, her fingers tightening around his before she settled back into exhausted slumber. Outside their window, the stars wheeled across the Montana sky, bearing witness to the miracle of new life and the enduring power of love that had begun with a chance encounter beside a creek. 5 years later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the yard of the Whitfield ranch as Zachariah finished securing the paddock gate. From the porch of their home, a spacious two-story structure built of local timber and stone, came the sound of children's laughter, drawing an involuntary smile to his face. 5 years had transformed not only the empty land they'd purchased, but the very fabric of their lives. The modest ranch had prospered, as had the school Nora had established in Butte, which now employed 3 teachers and served 60 children from across the region. Removing his gloves, Zachariah crossed to the porch, where 5-year-old Edward was regaling his younger sister with an elaborate tale involving his toy horses. Grace, not quite 3, listened with the solemn attention she accorded her adored older brother, her dark curls so like her mother's caught up in a ribbon that was slowly working its way loose. "And then the wild stallion jumped over the entire canyon," Edward declared, demonstrating with exaggerated motions. "Just like Papa's horse did when he was chasing the bad men," Zachariah chuckled, settling onto the porch step beside them. "I don't recall my horse jumping any canyons, son." Edward looked up, his blue eyes Nora's eyes wide with indignation. "But Uncle Thomas said—" "Uncle Thomas," Zachariah interrupted gently, "enjoys improving his stories with each telling." "Like Mama does with her school stories?" Grace asked, her small face serious. "Exactly like that," came Nora's voice as she emerged from the house, a basket of freshly baked bread in her arms. "The best stories grow a little in the telling." Zachariah rose to take the basket from her, stealing a quick kiss as he did so. After 5 years, such casual affection remained a constant between them, much to the occasional embarrassment of their son. "Papa," Edward protested, "not in front of everyone." "Everyone being you, your sister, and the chickens," Zachariah teased, ruffling the boy's dark hair. "Besides, your mother is particularly pretty today. A man can't help himself." Nora laughed, the sound as refreshing to Zachariah as it had been the first time he'd heard it. "Shameless flattery," she accused lightly, "though I won't discourage it." She did look particularly lovely, Zachariah thought. The years had added a few fine lines at the corners of her eyes, but otherwise had only enhanced her natural beauty. Motherhood and purpose had given her a confident grace that drew admiring glances whenever they visited town, glances Zachariah noted with a mixture of pride and the faint possessiveness he'd never quite overcome. "When will Uncle Thomas and Aunt Elizabeth arrive?" Edward asked eagerly. "Any time now," Nora answered, checking the horizon for approaching riders. Their train was due in Butte this morning. The news that Thomas Weber had finally proposed to Elizabeth after years of friendship had delighted both Whitfields. The couple had married in a small ceremony in Denver 3 months earlier, with the Whitfield family in attendance. This would be their first visit as husband and wife. "Will they bring presents?" Grace asked hopefully. "Grace Whitfield," Nora admonished gently. Is that all you think about when visitors come? The little girl considered this seriously. No, I also think about cake. Zachariah burst out laughing, scooping his daughter into his arms. Honest as her mother, at least. And direct as her father, Nora countered with a smile. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road, where two riders were visible in the distance. "They're here," Edward shouted, racing down the porch steps to the yard, heedless of Nora's call to be careful. Zachariah set Grace down, allowing her to follow her brother at a more measured pace, then turned to Nora. "Ready for a house full of guests, always," she assured him. "Though I suspect Thomas and Elizabeth will have eyes only for each other." Zachariah's expression softened. "As it should be in the early days of marriage." "Only the early days," Nora teased, stepping closer to straighten his collar. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "In our case, I expect it to be a lifelong affliction." The tenderness in his gaze still had the power to make Nora's heart race, even after years of marriage. "A wonderful affliction to have," she murmured. They might have lingered in the moment longer, but the visitors were approaching rapidly, with Edward running alongside Thomas's horse, peppering him with questions. The next hours passed in a flurry of activity welcoming the newlyweds, showing them to the guest room Nora had prepared, sharing a leisurely supper on the porch as the children regaled Uncle Thomas and Aunt Elizabeth with stories of ranch life. Later, after the children had been put to bed with promises of horseback rides in the morning, the adults gathered in the comfortable sitting room, glasses of fine whiskey in hand for the men and sherry for the ladies. "Married life seems to agree with you both," Nora observed, noting the easy affection between Thomas and Elizabeth. Elizabeth smiled, a becoming blush coloring her cheeks. "It's an adjustment after so many years of independence, but a pleasant one." "She means I'm hopeless at household matters," Thomas clarified with a self-deprecating laugh. "But learning." "As we all did," Zachariah said, his gaze meeting Nora's across the room. "Some adjustments are worth the effort." The conversation flowed easily between old friends, touching on Thomas's work with the Pinkerton Agency, Elizabeth's plans to establish a women's literary society in Denver, and news from Butte, where many of the people who had figured in their shared history still lived. "Sullivan retired last month," Nora mentioned. "Sold his mercantile to his nephew and bought a small place outside town. His wife is reportedly ecstatic to leave Butte society behind." "And Donnelly?" Thomas asked. "Still serving his sentence, I presume?" Zachariah nodded grimly. "Another 5 years at least, according to his last appeal hearing. His former associates have largely moved on to other ventures." "Speaking of moving on," Elizabeth interjected, clearly eager to change the subject to happier topics, "we have news of our own to share." Thomas reached for his wife's hand, his expression betraying barely contained excitement. "Elizabeth is expecting a child, due in early spring." Exclamations of delight filled the room as Nora moved to embrace her friend. "How wonderful! You must stay with us when the time comes." "But has an excellent doctor. Actually," Elizabeth interrupted gently, "we've been considering a more permanent arrangement." Thomas nodded, continuing the explanation. "I've been offered a position with the Territorial Marshal's office based here in Montana. It would mean less traveling, more stability. For our growing family," Elizabeth added, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. Nora clasped her hands in delight. "You're moving here, permanently." "If the offer of a teaching position at your school still stands," Elizabeth confirmed. "We thought perhaps a house in town, close enough to visit the ranch regularly." "The position is absolutely yours," Nora assured her, "and the children will be overjoyed to have their aunt and uncle nearby." As the women fell into animated discussion of housing options in Butte, Zachariah caught Thomas's eye, gesturing toward the porch. The men stepped outside into the crisp autumn night, the stars brilliant in the clear Montana sky. "Marshall's office," Zachariah commented, offering Thomas a cigar. "Quite a change from the Pinkertons." Thomas nodded, accepting the cigar and the light Zachariah offered. "Time for it. 10 years of chasing troublemakers across every territory is enough for any man, especially one about to become a father." "It changes everything," Zachariah agreed, his gaze drifting toward the window where Nora could be seen laughing with Elizabeth, "in all the best ways." "I have you to thank, you know," Thomas said after a comfortable silence. "You and Nora, watching the life you built together. It made me realize what I truly wanted." Zachariah shook his head, surprisingly moved by his friend's words. "We only did what felt right for us." "Exactly," Thomas agreed. "And now I'm doing the same." He glanced back at the house. "Though I admit, I never imagined settling down in Butte, of all places." "Life takes unexpected turns," Zachariah observed. 5 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be a rancher with a schoolteacher wife and 2 children, you'd have suggested they needed their head examined," Thomas finished with a laugh. The solitary Zachariah Whitfield, tamed by love. Though the words were teasing, there was truth in them that Zachariah couldn't deny. "Not tamed," he corrected thoughtfully. "Completed, perhaps." The conversation turned to more practical matters, the challenges of the marshal's position. The growing pains Butte was experiencing as it transitioned from mining camp to established city. The price of cattle and the prospects for the coming winter. When they eventually rejoined the women inside, plans had already been made for a joint excursion to Butte the following day to begin the search for a suitable house for the Webbers. Later that night, with their guests settled and the house quiet, Zachariah found Nora standing by their bedroom window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape of their ranch. "Happy?" he asked, coming to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. She leaned back against him with a contented sigh. "Immensely. Having Thomas and Elizabeth nearby will be wonderful, especially with the baby coming." "Our family keeps growing," Zachariah observed, pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck. Nora turned in his arms, a particular gleam in her eyes that he had come to recognize. "Speaking of growing families," she began, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Zachariah's breath caught as understanding dawned. "Nora, are you?" She nodded, her smile blossoming fully. "Doctor Morgan confirmed it yesterday. We'll welcome our 3rd child next summer." Joy surged through Zachariah as he gathered her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, her skin. "I love you," he whispered against her temple. "More than I ever thought possible." Nora drew back slightly to meet his gaze, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "And I love you, my solitary cowboy who couldn't let a stranger slip away." "Best decision I ever made," he said simply, before claiming her lips in a kiss that spoke of passion undiminished by time and deepened by the shared journey of their lives together. Outside their window, beyond the boundaries of the ranch they'd built together, Elk Creek continued its timeless journey across the Montana landscape, the same creek where fate had once brought a wounded woman and a lonely man together, forever changing both their destinies. In the bedroom down the hall, Edward and Grace slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge of their parents' love. In the guest room, Thomas and Elizabeth dreamed of the family they would soon begin. And throughout the house that Zachariah and Nora had made a home, the quiet rhythms of a life well lived continued their gentle cadence, all because a cowboy had once found a woman unconscious by a creek and couldn't bear to let her go. "Wake up," he had said those years ago. "I need you to stay." And she had stayed, creating with him a love story more beautiful than either could have imagined, a story still being written with each passing day, each shared joy and sorrow, each moment of the extraordinary, ordinary life they had built together in the heart of the Wild West.